And all of a sudden heard a big boom and everything went black.
April 19, 1995.
Everybody else that we work with is gone.
In gut-wrenching clarity, the true cost of revenge came into focus at 5th and Robinson.
It's on its way. It's this real busy moment.
The original Ground Zero, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, where mothers lost their babies,
Got one here!
where rescuers unearthed survivors. Oklahoma City broke wide open when a terrorist truck bomb changed us forever.
I remember wondering if I was dead or alive.
Well, there were ladies that were right beside me. They didn't make it out.
We are a block from where the blast occurred, and they are just treating people here on the side of the road about a block away.
We have heard reports that there is a daycare center in that building. We're looking at video of some of the victims.
We understand now that we are seeing some pictures of the arrival of some of the children who were in the daycare center located in that building.
The people that I talked to say they survived by diving underneath their desks.
When you see pictures of what is left of the federal building, it's hard to believe anybody is walking away from this explosion today.
It sounded like just one big boom, really loud. Then there was so much noise from everything falling in, though, you couldn't hear anything else.
Everything started going like this, and I dove under the desk, and then all the glass came in and the ceilings came down. And I probably got cut worse if I hadn't been under the desk. I just got little scrapes and scratches.
Just the whole back of the building just fell in on us. It's just, it was a big force. Just all fell in. Everyone along our set of offices had back injuries, head injuries, neck, bleeding, glass.
The bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens. It was an act of cowardice, and it was evil. The United States will not tolerate it.
It looks like it's a video from Beirut or something. You can see the wrought iron bars that are used for reinforcement, the rebar just sticking out there.
We have a parking lot across the street from the federal building, and the cars over there were demolished.
And that is a ladder truck from the Oklahoma City Fire Department. It looks like trying to rescue or at least looking for victims inside the Alfred P. Murrah building.
And we are now getting word from the Oklahoma City Fire Department that there are people trapped inside the building. They believe they are alive. They are trapped in the rubble.
We're talking to victims through void spaces. People are crying out to us. We're reassuring them the best we can. We're able to reach through cracks and hold people's hands and reassure them as best we can. But getting to them is going to take a long time.
The debris is gone and the building is no more. Now this is a place of peace and remembrance and life.
On June 11, 2001, Timothy James McVeigh was strapped to a gurney in the death chamber at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was 33 years old, a decorated Gulf War veteran who had once dreamed of joining the Army's elite special forces. Now he was about to become the first federal prisoner put to death in the United States in 38 years. At 7:10 in the morning, 3 drugs began flowing into his veins. His eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling. 4 minutes later, Timothy McVeigh was pronounced dead. He had been executed for killing 168 people, including 19 young lads, in the worst act of domestic terrorism in American history. McVeigh was put to death for bombing the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995. At 9:02 that morning, a rental truck packed with nearly 5,000 pounds of fertilizer and racing fuel exploded in front of the 9-story building. The blast tore away the entire front of the structure. Floors collapsed on top of each other. Bodies were buried under tons of concrete and steel. The daycare center on the 2nd floor was destroyed in an instant. Toddlers died before they knew what was happening. Parents who kissed their children goodbye that morning had no idea it would be the last time. McVeigh did not act alone. 2 fellow soldiers he had met at Fort Benning in 1988 helped him plan and carry out the attack. Terry Nichols was a Michigan farmer, 13 years older than McVeigh. He helped buy thousands of pounds of fertilizer, robbed a gun dealer to pay for the operation, and helped put the bomb together. Michael Fortier was McVeigh's roommate during basic training. He drove with McVeigh to Oklahoma City to look at the target building, sold stolen guns to raise money, and watched his wife make the fake driver's license smoored. McVeigh used to rent the truck. Both men knew exactly what was going to happen. Neither one tried to stop it. McVeigh never denied what he had done. He called the victims collateral damage, using military language to describe the murder of innocent people. His execution was shown on closed-circuit television to survivors and victims' families in Oklahoma City. It was the first time in American history that people could watch an execution from a remote location. More than 200 people chose to watch him die. They hoped it would bring them peace. Many felt nothing but emptiness. But before we look at that final day, there is a story that needs to be told. A story about a lonely boy from New York who escaped into fantasies of revenge after his parents split up. About a good soldier who came home from the Gulf War haunted by what he had seen and done. This is the story of Timothy McVeigh. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. On April 23, 1968, in the small city of Lockport, New York, Noreen and William McVeigh welcomed their second child and only son into the world. They named him Timothy James McVeigh. His arrival came during one of the most turbulent years in American history. Just 4 days earlier, the nation had buried Martin Luther King Jr., assassinated on a Memphis balcony. In 2 months, Robert Kennedy would be shot dead in a Los Angeles hotel kitchen. Cities were burning. Protesters filled the streets. The Vietnam War was tearing the country apart. But in the working-class neighborhoods near Buffalo, life moved at a slower pace. Lockport was a blue-collar town built along the Erie Canal, where men worked in factories and women raised children in modest homes with small yards. The McVeighs were typical of their community. Hard-working, church-going, and focused on providing a stable life for their family. Tim was the middle child, born between 2 sisters. Patricia was the oldest, Jennifer the youngest. The family soon moved to Pendleton, a quiet suburban community about 20 miles northeast of Buffalo. Their home on Meyer Road sat on a rural stretch surrounded by farms and open fields. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and children played outside until the streetlights came on. William McVeigh worked long hours at the Harrison Radiator Plant, a General Motors manufacturing facility that employed thousands of workers from the surrounding communities. He was a quiet, steady man who believed in hard work and providing for his family. He rarely missed a shift and never complained about the grueling hours on the factory floor. His dedication to his job meant he was often absent from home. Tim's mother, Noreen, whom everyone called Mickey, worked at a local travel agency. She was more outgoing than her husband, but the marriage was troubled from early on. The couple argued frequently, and the tension in the household was something all 3 children noticed. Mickey felt trapped in a life that had not turned out the way she planned. William buried himself in work to avoid confrontation. The McVeigh family was Irish Catholic, and young Tim was raised in the faith. He attended Mass regularly with his father at Good Shepherd Church in Pendleton. He went through the standard Catholic milestones, First Communion, Confession, and eventually Confirmation in 1985. But religion never seemed to take deep root in Tim. He went through the motions without developing any strong spiritual convictions. Later in life, he would describe himself as agnostic, uncertain whether God existed at all. By most accounts, Tim was an unremarkable child in his early years. Some neighbors on Meyer Road remembered him as cheerful and playful. A skinny kid who liked to ride his bicycle and play in the fields near his house. Others recalled a quieter boy who preferred to be alone, spending hours in his room rather than playing with other children. He was neither popular nor unpopular at school, neither an outstanding student nor a troublemaker. He simply blended into the background. What everyone agreed on was that something changed when Tim was 10 years old. In 1978, his parents' troubled marriage finally collapsed. Noreen and William separated, beginning a divorce process that would take years to finalize. The split was bitter, and the children were caught in the middle. When the time came to decide living arrangements, Noreen and William gave their children a choice about where to live. Both Patricia and Jennifer chose to go with their mother. Tim made a different decision. He chose to stay with his father in the house on Meyer Road. He later explained that he blamed his mother for the breakup and did not want his father to be left alone. The resentment toward his mother would linger for years. But choosing to live with William McVeigh meant choosing a life of solitude. William continued working long shifts at the radiator plant, sometimes double shifts to make extra money. He left early in the morning and returned late at night. On weekends, he was often too exhausted to do much more than watch television or work on projects around the house. He loved his son in his own quiet way, but he did not know how to express it. Tim had few memories of real conversations with either of his parents during his childhood. The house on Meyer Road was often empty when he came home from school. He would let himself in with a key, make himself a snack, and spend the afternoon alone until his father returned from work. It was during these lonely years that Tim developed two passions that would define the rest of his life: computers and guns. He was fascinated by technology, spending hours on his Commodore 64 computer, learning to program and exploring the early networks that would eventually become the internet. He taught himself to hack, breaking into computer systems just to see if he could. He was good at it. But his deeper passion was firearms. Tim's grandfather, Edward McVeigh, became the most significant adult influence in his young life. The elder McVeigh was a veteran who understood guns and respected their power. He took his grandson shooting, teaching him to handle weapons with care and precision. He showed Tim how to clean a rifle, how to aim properly, how to respect the deadly force he held in his hands. Tim was entranced. Guns represented everything he lacked in his daily life: power, control, self-reliance. The gun did not care if you were skinny or awkward or lonely. The gun made you equal to anyone. Tim began collecting firearms, starting with small purchases and gradually building an arsenal that would grow throughout his teenage years. At school, Tim faced another challenge that shaped his developing worldview. He was tall and thin, awkward in his teenage body, and he became a target for bullies. The abuse was not constant, but it was memorable. Larger boys shoved him in hallways. Classmates mocked his skinny frame and quiet demeanor. He had few friends to defend him and no older brothers to back him up. Tim's social isolation extended to romantic relationships. He was nervous around girls and did not know how to talk to them. He had one girlfriend during his high school years, but the relationship was brief and awkward. By high school, Tim had discovered something else that captured his attention: survivalist culture. He read magazines like Soldier of Fortune, which featured articles about mercenaries, military tactics, and government conspiracies. He devoured books about survival skills, imagining scenarios where he would need to live off the land after society collapsed. He began stockpiling supplies and ammunition. Tim dreamed of owning a gun shop someday, a place where he could surround himself with the weapons he loved and share his passion with like-minded customers. It seemed like a realistic goal for a young man without much ambition for college or professional careers. Guns were what he knew, what he loved, what made him feel powerful. Then he discovered a book that would change the trajectory of his life forever. It was a cheap paperback novel with a crude cover, sold at gun shows and through mail-order catalogs. The book was called The Turner Diaries. The Turner Diaries was written in 1978 by William Luther Pierce, a former physics professor who had become one of America's most prominent white nationalists. The novel depicted a violent overthrow of the United States government by a group of white supremacists. The story was crude and racist, filled with graphic violence and hateful ideology. But for Tim McVeigh, The Turner Diaries became something close to scripture. The book's protagonist, Earl Turner, wages war against a tyrannical federal government that has confiscated citizens' firearms. In one pivotal scene, Turner drives a truck loaded with homemade explosives to the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and detonates it at 9:15 in the morning, killing hundreds of people. McVeigh read the book during his teenage years and became obsessed with its message. He saw the federal government not as a democratic institution, but as an enemy of American freedom. The book fed his growing paranoia about government overreach, particularly regarding the Second Amendment, right to bear arms. The seeds of mass murder had been planted in his mind. In 1986, Tim graduated from Star Point Central High School. Despite his intelligence, his grades were mediocre. He had been named most promising computer programmer by his classmates, having taught himself to hack into computer systems on his Commodore 64. He even claimed to have broken into government computers, but academic achievement held little interest for him. After graduation, Tim enrolled briefly at Bryant and Stratton College, a local business school, but dropped out quickly. He drifted into a job as a security guard, working night shifts at Burke Armored Car Service. The work was tedious, but it allowed him to carry a gun legally, which appealed to his obsession with firearms. During this period, Tim purchased a parcel of land in rural western New York. He used the property for target practice, spending hours alone in the woods shooting at bottles and cans. He began stockpiling weapons and survival gear. He talked to coworkers about government conspiracies and the coming collapse of society. But Tim was restless. The security guard job felt like a dead end. He had no girlfriend, few friends, and no clear direction. He lived in his father's house, feeling like a failure at 20 years old. He needed something to give his life meaning, structure, and purpose. While Timothy McVeigh was growing up in suburban New York, another man was living a very different life in rural Michigan. Terry Lynn Nichols was born on April 1, 1955, in Lapeer, a small farming community about 60 miles north of Detroit. He was 13 years older than McVeigh, and their paths would not cross for decades. But when they finally met, the consequences would be catastrophic. Nichols was the middle child in a family of 3 boys. His father, Robert, worked as a farmer and carpenter, scraping together a living from the Michigan soil. His mother, Joyce, was a homemaker who struggled with the demands of raising 3 sons on a modest income. The family was not poor, but they were never comfortable. Money was always tight, and luxuries were rare. Terry was a quiet child, unremarkable in school, more comfortable with machinery than with people. He learned to drive tractors before he could drive cars. He could repair engines and operate combines. He understood the rhythms of farm life: planting in spring, cultivating in summer, harvesting in fall, and surviving the brutal Michigan winters. He graduated from Lapeer High School in 1973 without any clear direction. Unlike McVeigh, who would later excel in the military, Nichols showed no particular ambition or drive. He drifted through his 20s, trying different jobs and different relationships, never finding satisfaction in any of them. His adult life was marked by instability and failure. He married his first wife, Lana, in 1974, when he was just 19 years old. They had a son together, a boy named Josh, but the marriage fell apart within a few years. Nichols was difficult to live with, moody and withdrawn, prone to angry outbursts about politics and government. Lana eventually left him, taking their son with her. By his 30s, Nichols had worked as a farmer, a grain elevator manager, a real estate salesman, and a ranch hand in Kansas. Nothing seemed to stick. He drifted from job to job, always searching for something he could not find. He blamed the government for his failures, convinced that taxes and regulations were keeping ordinary Americans from succeeding. In 1990, Nichols found a new wife through an unusual method. He ordered a mail-order bride from the Philippines, a young woman named Marifa Torres. She was just 17 years old when they married. Nichols was 35. The age difference raised eyebrows, but Nichols did not care what others thought. Marifa bore him a son named Jason. But this relationship was also troubled, marked by arguments about money and Terry's increasingly radical political views. Marifa came from a culture that valued family and stability. Terry offered neither. He was consumed by conspiracy theories and anti-government rhetoric, spending hours reading extremist literature and listening to shortwave radio broadcasts about the coming collapse of American society. By the late 1980s, Nichols had declared himself a sovereign citizen, a member of a loosely organized movement that rejected the authority of the federal government. He believed that the United States had been secretly replaced by an illegitimate corporation. He refused to pay federal income taxes, arguing that the 16th Amendment had never been properly ratified. He renounced his driver's license, his Social Security number, and even his birth certificate, claiming they were contracts that bound him to an illegitimate government. Nichols wrote angry letters to government officials challenging their authority. He returned his voter registration card with a note declaring that he was no longer a citizen of the United States. He told local officials that he would no longer recognize their jurisdiction over him. The third man in this conspiracy came from the American Southwest. Michael Fortier was born and raised in Kingman, Arizona, a small desert town of about 12,000 people, located near the Nevada border, about 100 miles southeast of Las Vegas. Kingman sat in the high desert of northwestern Arizona, surrounded by mountains and sagebrush. The summers were brutally hot, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees. The winters were mild but windy. It was the kind of place where people valued their privacy and distrusted outsiders. The federal government felt very far away, and most residents preferred it that way. Fortier grew up in this environment, learning to shoot before he learned to drive. Guns were a way of life in Kingman, tools for hunting and protection in a landscape where rattlesnakes and coyotes were constant companions. Like many young men in rural Arizona, Fortier developed a deep suspicion of the federal government and a fierce attachment to his Second Amendment rights. After high school, Fortier married his high school sweetheart, a young woman named Lori Hart. They had 2 children together and settled into a modest life in the Arizona desert. Fortier worked a series of jobs: construction, retail, odd jobs for neighbors. Nothing paid particularly well, and the family struggled to make ends meet. To supplement his income, Fortier began selling marijuana. It was a common sideline in Kingman, where law enforcement was stretched thin and the desert provided endless hiding places. Fortier was careful about his dealing, selling only to people he knew and trusted. He made enough to keep his family afloat, but never enough to get ahead. In May 1988, these 3 very different men arrived at Fort Benning, Georgia, for basic training in the United States Army. Timothy McVeigh was 20 years old, eager to escape his dead-end life in Pendleton and prove himself as a soldier. Terry Nichols was 33, an unusually old recruit who needed structure and a steady paycheck after years of drifting. Michael Fortier was young and aimless, looking for direction and adventure. The Army brought them together, and their shared beliefs would bind them in a conspiracy that would kill 168 people. McVeigh arrived at Fort Benning with something to prove. He had spent 2 years working as a security guard, watching his life go nowhere. The Army represented everything he wanted: discipline, purpose, weapons training, and the chance to be part of something larger than himself. From the first day of basic training, he stood out. While other recruits struggled with the physical demands and strict discipline of Army life, McVeigh thrived. He embraced the structure, the hierarchy, and especially the weapons training with enthusiasm that impressed his drill instructors. He was always the first to volunteer, the last to quit, the most eager to please. His fellow recruits began to see him as a natural leader. Nichols arrived at Fort Benning with different motivations. At 33, he was old enough to be the father of most recruits. His second marriage was struggling, his finances were a mess, and he needed the Army's steady paycheck and benefits. He was not there to prove anything. He was there to survive. The physical demands of basic training were harder for Nichols than for the younger recruits. His body ached after long marches. He struggled to keep up during runs, but he persevered, driven by the knowledge that he had no other options. He needed the Army to work. Fortier was assigned as McVeigh's roommate in the barracks. The 2 young men hit it off immediately. They shared interests in guns, survivalism, and anti-government politics. They stayed up late, talking about the Turner Diaries and what it meant for America's future. They discussed Ruby Ridge and the dangers of federal overreach. They found in each other kindred spirits who understood what was wrong with the country. Despite their age difference, McVeigh and Nichols also formed a bond. They recognized in each other a shared distrust of the federal government, a belief that something was fundamentally wrong with America. McVeigh introduced Nichols to the Turner Diaries, and Nichols became a devoted reader. The book confirmed everything he already believed about government tyranny. The three men spent their evenings talking about politics, guns, and the future. They discussed what they would do if the government tried to confiscate their weapons. They talked about Ruby Ridge and what it meant for gun owners. They shared conspiracy theories about the New World Order and United Nations troops secretly stationed on American soil. The conversations planted seeds that would bear terrible fruit years later. But the Army would take these three men in different directions before bringing them back together for the final act. Nichols did not last long in the military. After less than a year of service, he requested a hardship discharge, claiming he needed to return to Michigan to care for his young son Josh from his first marriage. The Army granted his request in May 1989. Nichols returned to Michigan without completing his enlistment. He never saw combat and earned none of the distinctions that McVeigh would achieve. Back in civilian life, Nichols became even more radical. His sovereign citizen beliefs intensified. He stopped paying taxes altogether. He began experimenting with explosives on his family's farm, mixing household chemicals to see what combinations would detonate. He was preparing for a war that existed only in his mind. Fortier completed his enlistment without incident. He was an adequate but unremarkable soldier, earning no special distinctions. When his term was up, he returned to Kingman, Arizona, married Lori, and settled into his struggling existence. He stayed in touch with McVeigh, writing letters and making occasional phone calls. The friendship would prove fateful. McVeigh was the only one of the three who truly succeeded in the Army. After basic training, he was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division at Fort Riley, Kansas. He quickly rose through the ranks, becoming a gunner on a Bradley fighting vehicle. His skill with weapons earned him respect and recognition. He was twice named Top Gun in his battalion, recognized for his marksmanship with the Bradley's 25mm cannon. His fellow soldiers saw him as the ideal infantryman. He was disciplined, focused, and professional. He kept his barracks area spotless. He followed orders without question. He was described as the epitome of infantry and a follow-me kind of guy. McVeigh had finally found a place where he belonged. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait and the world changed. President George H.W. Bush began assembling an international coalition to drive Saddam Hussein's forces out of the small oil-rich nation. Timothy McVeigh's unit, the 1st Infantry Division, was deployed to Saudi Arabia as part of Operation Desert Shield. McVeigh was excited. This was what he had trained for. He had spent 2 years preparing for combat, honing his skills as a Bradley gunner, dreaming of the day he would face a real enemy. That day had finally arrived. Before deploying, McVeigh had been selected for Special Forces Assessment. It was his dream to become a Green Beret, the Army's elite special operations unit. The Green Berets represented everything he admired: discipline, skill, independence, and the ability to operate behind enemy lines with minimal support. But the deployment to the Gulf interrupted that plan. McVeigh's assessment was postponed. He went to war instead. When Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991, McVeigh was ready. The ground war lasted only 100 hours, but those hours were intense. McVeigh saw combat on the first day. He hit an Iraqi tank from more than 500 yards away. Later, he decapitated an Iraqi soldier with cannon fire from over 1,000 yards. He received multiple commendations, including the Bronze Star for bravery. The Army held him up as a model soldier. But something changed in McVeigh during the war. The reality of combat was different from his fantasies. He had dreamed of heroic battle, of facing a worthy enemy in honorable combat. What he found was slaughter. The highway of death haunted him. As Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait, American aircraft caught them on the highway north to Basra. Thousands of vehicles were destroyed in a massive traffic jam of death. When McVeigh's unit passed through the aftermath, he saw what American firepower could do to human beings. Bodies charred beyond recognition. Vehicles melted into twisted metal. the smell of burning flesh that stayed in his nostrils for days. Soldiers who had been trying to surrender incinerated before they could raise their hands. McVeigh had been trained to kill, and he had done so efficiently. But the reality of mass death was different from the training exercises at Fort Riley. He was shocked by what he had seen and done. The experience left marks that would not heal. Something inside him shifted. The government he had served with such devotion began to look different. He had killed for his country, and now he wondered if his country was worth killing for. When Timothy McVeigh returned from the Gulf War in the spring of 1991, he was a decorated combat veteran at 22 years old. His Bronze Star and Combat Infantry badge marked him as a soldier who had proven himself under fire. He should have been proud. Instead, he was beginning to unravel. Almost immediately upon returning, McVeigh reported for his long-awaited Special Forces assessment at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Becoming a Green Beret had been his dream since joining the Army. The elite unit represented everything he admired. He had spent years preparing for this moment, but he was physically and mentally exhausted from months of combat. The 21-day assessment course was designed to break candidates, to push them past their limits, and identify those with the mental toughness to serve in special operations. McVeigh lasted just 2 days. On the second day, he quit. He told other candidates he had injured his ankle during a march. But in a letter to his superiors, he admitted the truth. He was not physically ready. The failure devastated him. His psychological evaluation during the assessment noted that he was unsuitable for Special Forces. The Army's elite unit did not want him. The rejection cut deep into his sense of identity. McVeigh had defined himself as a soldier, as a warrior who would rise to the highest levels of military service. Now that identity lay in ruins. He had failed at the one thing he thought he was good at. McVeigh's disillusionment with the military grew rapidly after that. He began to question the government he had served. He talked to fellow soldiers about how Iraqi civilians had been killed in the bombing campaigns, how he had witnessed the execution of surrendering prisoners. He felt used and discarded, a weapon the government had deployed and then set aside when no longer needed. By the end of 1991, he had requested and received an early discharge. On December 31, 1991, Tim McVeigh left the Army. He packed his belongings, said goodbye to the few friends he had made, and drove back to New York. The structure and purpose that had defined his life for nearly 4 years was gone. He returned to Pendleton, moving back into his father's house on Meyer Road. At 23, he was right back where he started. He got another job as a security guard at Burke Armored Car Service, the same dead-end work he had done before enlisting. The pay was poor, the hours were long, and the work was tedious. The excitement of Army life was gone. In its place was boredom, frustration, and growing rage. Meanwhile, Terry Nichols had been back in Michigan for 2 years, sinking deeper into his sovereign citizen beliefs. You would recall, he had married Marife from the Philippines, and they had a young son. But the marriage was troubled, and Nichols spent more time reading extremist literature than tending to his family. After McVeigh's discharge, the two men reconnected. McVeigh began visiting the Nichols farm in Decker, Michigan, during his travels. The visits became more frequent. Together with Terry's brother James, they experimented with explosives in the fields behind the farmhouse. They mixed household chemicals in plastic jugs and detonated them to see what worked. The experiments were dangerous and illegal, but neither man cared. They were preparing for war. Michael Fortier had also stayed in touch with McVeigh. After leaving the Army, Fortier had returned to Kingman and married Lori. They had 2 children and were struggling to make ends meet. McVeigh visited them regularly during his travels on the gun show circuit, staying at their small house for days or weeks at a time. McVeigh became so close to the family that he served as best man at Michael and Lori's wedding in 1993. McVeigh later described this period as a time of profound unhappiness. After experiencing the extremes of combat, everyday civilian life felt meaningless. He wrote angry letters to newspapers complaining about government policies on gun control. He complained to his sister Jennifer about taxes, and what he saw as the erosion of constitutional rights. He felt the country he had fought for was betraying its founding principles. Then came Ruby Ridge. In August 1992, something happened that pushed McVeigh further toward the edge. In the mountains of northern Idaho, federal marshals attempted to arrest a white separatist named Randy Weaver on firearms charges. Weaver was a former Army Green Beret who had moved his family to a remote cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho. He wanted to live off the grid, away from a government he believed was corrupt and tyrannical. He homeschooled his children and taught them to distrust outsiders. He had attended meetings of the Aryan Nations, a white supremacist group, though he claimed he was not a member. In 1989, an undercover ATF agent convinced Weaver to sell him 2 sawed-off shotguns, weapons that were illegal under federal law. Weaver was charged with the sale and ordered to appear in court. He failed to appear, either because he never received the summons or because he chose to ignore it. The U.S. Marshals Service was sent to bring him in. What followed became known as the Ruby Ridge Standoff. On August 21, 1992, 6 marshals approached the Weaver cabin on a reconnaissance mission. They encountered Randy Weaver, his 14-year-old son Samuel, and a family friend named Kevin Harris in the woods. A firefight erupted. When the shooting stopped, Samuel Weaver, Randy's son, and Deputy Marshal William Deegan were dead. The FBI's hostage rescue team was called in. They surrounded the cabin and established a perimeter. The rules of engagement were modified to allow agents to shoot any armed adult male outside the cabin. It was an unusual and controversial order. On August 22nd, FBI sniper Lon Horiuchi fired 2 shots from his position on a ridge overlooking the cabin. The first shot wounded Randy Weaver in the arm. The second shot was aimed at Kevin Harris, who was running toward the cabin door. The bullet struck Vicki Weaver, Randy's wife, instead. Vicki Weaver was standing in the doorway of the cabin, holding her 10-month-old daughter Elisheba in her arms. The bullet entered her head and killed her instantly. The baby was unharmed but covered in her mother's blood. The standoff continued for 9 more days before Randy Weaver finally surrendered. He was charged with multiple crimes, but was acquitted of all charges except the original failure to appear and a minor weapons violation. The government paid his family over $3 million in a wrongful death settlement. To Timothy McVeigh and others in the growing militia movement, Ruby Ridge was proof that the federal government had declared war on its own citizens. An FBI sniper had killed a woman holding a baby. A 14-year-old boy had been shot in the back, and the government officials responsible faced no consequences. McVeigh saw the incident as evidence of everything the Turner Diaries had warned about. The government was coming for gun owners. Constitutional rights meant nothing to federal agents with sniper rifles. Violence against women and children was acceptable if the government decided you were a threat. His anger hardened into something colder and more dangerous. He began distributing business cards at gun shows printed with Lon Horiuchi's home address, hoping someone in the militia movement would assassinate the FBI sniper. He considered targeting Horiuchi himself before settling on a different plan. Ruby Ridge became McVeigh's first touchstone, the first proof that his paranoid beliefs were justified. But a far greater catalyst was coming. 6 months after Ruby Ridge, the federal government would provide McVeigh with all the justification he needed. On February 28, 1993, agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms attempted to execute a search warrant at the Mount Carmel compound near Waco, Texas. The compound was home to the Branch Davidians, a religious group led by a charismatic preacher named David Koresh. Koresh, born Vernon Howell, claimed to be a prophet who could interpret the 7 seals of the Book of Revelation. He had taken multiple wives, some of them young girls. He stockpiled weapons, believing that a final confrontation with the forces of evil was imminent. The ATF suspected the group was stockpiling illegal automatic weapons and converting semi-automatic rifles to fully automatic fire. The raid was supposed to be a surprise. Agents had trained for weeks, rehearsing their approach to the sprawling compound. But someone tipped off the Davidians. When 76 ATF agents arrived in cattle trailers, Koresh and his followers were waiting. Someone fired a shot. To this day, both sides blame the other for starting the violence. Within seconds, a full-scale gun battle erupted. The agents were outgunned. The Davidians had superior firepower and defensive positions. The ATF had expected to surprise unarmed civilians. Instead, they walked into a kill zone. When the shooting stopped, 4 ATF agents lay dead. 6 Branch Davidians had also been killed. Koresh himself was wounded. The federal government pulled back and began a siege that would last 51 days. Timothy McVeigh was watching on television from his father's house in Pendleton when the standoff began. What he saw enraged him. Federal agents surrounding American citizens. Tanks and armored vehicles deployed against a religious community. The full force of the United States government arrayed against people who, in McVeigh's view, were simply exercising their constitutional rights. He did something that revealed how far he had traveled down the path of radicalization. He got in his car and drove more than 1,000 miles to Waco to see the siege for himself. He arrived in early March 1993 and found a carnival-like atmosphere at the perimeter. Protesters, journalists, curious onlookers, and militia members had all gathered to watch the standoff unfold. Vendors sold T-shirts and bumper stickers. Conspiracy theorists handed out pamphlets. It was part protest, part spectacle, part political rally. McVeigh set up a table on the hood of his car and began selling bumper stickers with slogans like, "When guns are outlawed, I will become an outlaw," and "Fear the government that fears your gun." He handed out pro-gun literature to anyone who would take it. He talked to fellow protesters about the coming war against federal tyranny. A student journalist named Michelle Rock interviewed him during this period. McVeigh told her that the government was afraid of an armed citizenry. "The government is afraid of the guns people have because they have to have control of the people at all times," he said. "Once you take away the guns, you can do anything to the people." The interview was broadcast on local television. McVeigh was becoming a public face of the militia movement. For weeks, McVeigh watched as FBI negotiators tried to convince Koresh to surrender. He listened to militia rhetoric about government tyranny being broadcast on shortwave radio. He saw the Branch Davidians not as members of a fringe religious group, but as fellow Americans being persecuted for exercising their Second Amendment rights. His hatred of the federal government intensified with each passing day. Then came April 19, 1993. That morning, FBI agents launched a final assault on the compound. Using specially modified M60 tanks, they punched holes in the wooden walls and began pumping CS gas into the building. CS gas is a powerful tear gas that causes intense burning of the eyes, skin, and respiratory system. The goal was to force the Davidians out without further bloodshed. The plan failed catastrophically. Within hours, fires broke out inside the compound. The origin of the fires remains disputed. The FBI claimed the Davidians started them deliberately. Survivors claimed the tank assaults knocked over lanterns or that the CS gas was ignited by gunfire. Whatever the cause, the wooden structure became an inferno. Firefighters were held back, unable to approach the burning building. The heat was too intense, and gunfire could still be heard from inside the compound. They watched helplessly as the flames consumed the building and everyone inside. When the flames finally died down, 76 people were dead. Among them were 25 children. David Koresh died in the fire, along with most of his followers. Autopsies would reveal that some had been shot, possibly by other Davidians who saw death as preferable to capture. McVeigh was enraged beyond anything he had felt before. He later said that watching women and children die at Waco convinced him that the federal government was willing to murder its own citizens. The use of gas particularly angered him. He had been exposed to the gas during Army training and knew its brutal effects on the respiratory system. Using it on children, in an enclosed space, was an act of war against innocent people. In the weeks after Waco, McVeigh visited his old Army friend Terry Nichols at the Nichols family farm in Decker, Michigan. Together they watched television coverage of the aftermath. Congressional hearings, angry accusations, government officials defending their actions. McVeigh and Nichols discussed what had happened late into the night. During this visit, Terry Nichols's brother James taught them both how to make explosives by combining common household chemicals in plastic jugs. They experimented in the fields behind the farmhouse, testing different mixtures and detonation methods. The conversations were no longer theoretical. McVeigh had decided that the government needed to pay for what it had done at Ruby Ridge and Waco. After Waco, Timothy McVeigh abandoned any pretense of normal life. He quit his security guard job at Burke Armored Car Service, moved out of his father's house on Meyer Road, and began living out of his car. For the next 2 years, he traveled across the United States, following the gun show circuit from state to state, sleeping in motels when he could afford them, and in his vehicle when he could not. Gun shows in the early 1990s were more than just places to buy and sell firearms. They were gathering points for the growing militia movement, forums for anti-government ideology, and marketplaces for survivalist gear and extremist literature. Tables displayed everything from hunting rifles to military surplus equipment to pamphlets warning about the New World Order. McVeigh fit right in among the camouflage-wearing vendors and suspicious customers. He sold copies of the Turner Diaries at a loss, sometimes giving them away for free to anyone who seemed receptive. He hawked bumper stickers with anti-ATF slogans and T-shirts mocking federal agents. He found that the further west he traveled, the more receptive people were to his message. The militia movement was strongest in states like Arizona, Montana, and Michigan, where distrust of the federal government ran deep. McVeigh also distributed business cards printed with the home address of Lon Horiuchi, the FBI sniper who had killed Vicki Weaver at Ruby Ridge. The cards encouraged recipients to write him a letter. McVeigh later admitted he hoped someone in the militia movement would use the information to assassinate Horiuchi. He even considered targeting Horiuchi himself before settling on a different plan. The gun show culture reinforced everything McVeigh already believed. He met people who were convinced that the United Nations was preparing to take over the United States, using foreign troops already stationed on American soil. He heard stories about black helicopters conducting surveillance on rural communities. He learned about secret government programs designed to confiscate weapons from law-abiding citizens. He found a community of like-minded individuals who validated his paranoia and fueled his rage. Between gun shows, McVeigh split his time between 2 locations that would become central to his plot. He stayed with Terry Nichols and his brother James on their farm in Decker, Michigan. The Nichols farm was isolated, surrounded by fields and forest, perfect for the kind of activities McVeigh had in mind. He also visited Michael Fortier in Kingman, Arizona. During this period, McVeigh's behavior became increasingly erratic. He told friends that the Army had implanted a computer microchip in his buttocks during his military service so the government could track his movements. He visited Area 51 in Nevada, the secretive military installation that conspiracy theorists believed housed alien spacecraft, specifically to defy government photography restrictions. He drove to Gulfport, Mississippi, to investigate rumors about United Nations troops being stationed on American soil. His mental state was deteriorating rapidly. He struggled with profound loneliness, having never maintained a serious romantic relationship. Women seemed to make him nervous, and his awkward attempts at connection usually failed. He nursed deep resentments about these rejections. By the fall of 1994, Timothy McVeigh had made his decision. He would build a massive bomb using ammonium nitrate fertilizer and racing fuel. He would pack it into a rental truck. He would drive that truck to a federal building filled with government employees, and he would detonate it on April 19th, the second anniversary of the Waco fire, the anniversary of Lexington and Concord. He would fire the first shot in a new American Revolution. He just needed help to make it happen. In October 1994, McVeigh arrived at Michael Fortier's home in Kingman, Arizona, with something to show them. He had drawn a detailed diagram of a bomb he planned to build. The design was based on the truck bomb described in the Turner Diaries, the scene where Earl Turner destroys the FBI headquarters in Washington. McVeigh spread the diagram on the Fortier's kitchen table. He explained how he would pack plastic barrels filled with ammonium nitrate and nitromethane into a rental truck and detonate them in front of a federal building. He had calculated the amount of explosive needed, the optimal placement of the barrels, the type of fuse that would ensure detonation. He used soup cans arranged on the 40-year's living room floor to demonstrate how the barrels would be positioned in the truck. He explained the chemistry of the explosion, how the ammonium nitrate would provide the main explosive force, while the nitromethane would increase the blast's power. He showed them how he would use a dual fuse system to ensure detonation. McVeigh had clearly been planning this for months. Then, McVeigh asked Fortier to help. He wanted his old Army roommate to be part of the attack, to help carry out what would become the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. He needed someone he could trust, someone who shared his beliefs, someone willing to take action against the government. Fortier refused to participate directly. He told McVeigh he was not willing to help plant the bomb or drive the truck. He had a wife and children to consider. The consequences of getting caught were too severe. He was not prepared to die or spend the rest of his life in prison. But critically, Fortier did not refuse to help entirely. He did not walk away. He did not report McVeigh to authorities. Instead, he agreed to assist in other ways. He would sell weapons to raise money for the plot. He would provide other support as needed. He would keep McVeigh's secret. In December 1994, Fortier drove with McVeigh from Arizona to Oklahoma City. They spent hours scouting the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, driving around the 9-story structure and examining its layout. McVeigh pointed out where he would park the truck bomb, directly in front of the building's glass facade. He explained how the blast would collapse the structure, killing everyone inside. Fortier listened, asked questions, and did nothing to stop the plan. He later claimed he did not believe McVeigh would actually go through with it. He thought it was just talk, the kind of angry fantasy that militia members indulged in but never acted upon. This claim would ring hollow at his trial. Fortier helped in other practical ways as well. He sold weapons that McVeigh and Nichols had stolen from a gun dealer named Roger Moore in Arkansas. The proceeds, thousands of dollars in cash, helped finance the bombing plot. Fortier helped too. She laminated the fake driver's license that McVeigh would use to rent the Ryder truck under the alias Robert D. Kling. She knew exactly what the fake identification would be used for. She knew that her husband's friend was planning to bomb a federal building, and like her husband, she said nothing. Perhaps most damning of all, Michael Fortier knew exactly when and where the attack would happen. McVeigh had told him the date, April 19th, 1995. He had shown him the target, the Murrah Building in Oklahoma City. He knew that innocent people, including children in the building's daycare center, would die. And Fortier said nothing. He did not warn the FBI. He did not call the local police. He did not even try to talk McVeigh out of his plan. He simply waited for the news he knew would come. Terry Nichols was more directly involved in the preparations. In February 1995, he bought a small house in Harrington, Kansas, paying cash for the down payment. The town was located near Fort Riley, where McVeigh had been stationed during his Army service. It was also close to farm supply stores where large quantities of ammonium nitrate fertilizer could be purchased without raising suspicion. The house would serve as a staging area for the plot. Materials could be stored there. The bomb could be assembled nearby. It was the perfect location for the final preparations. Before we continue with this story, if you're finding this documentary informative, take a moment to subscribe to No Way Out and hit that notification bell. We spend countless hours researching these cases to bring you the full story, not just the headlines. Your subscription helps us continue this work. The planning began in earnest in September 1994. Timothy McVeigh had spent months considering potential targets for his attack. He wanted a federal building, something that housed the agencies he blamed for Ruby Ridge and Waco. He considered several options, including buildings in Arkansas, Missouri, and Arizona. But he kept coming back to one location, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The Murrah building had several advantages from McVeigh's perspective. It housed offices for 14 federal agencies, including the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the agency he blamed most directly for the assault on the Branch Davidian compound. It also contained offices for the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Secret Service, and various other federal law enforcement agencies. Attacking this building would strike at the heart of what McVeigh considered the enemy. The building's location also appealed to him. It sat on a public street with easy access for a large truck. The north face of the structure featured a glass curtain wall that would offer little resistance to a powerful blast. And Oklahoma City was centrally located, easy to reach from Kansas, where McVeigh and Nichols had been gathering their materials. McVeigh had briefly considered another target, a building in Little Rock, Arkansas, that housed ATF offices. But he rejected it when he noticed a florist shop on the ground floor. He did not want to kill the small business owner who ran the shop. This detail would later haunt prosecutors and victims' families. On September 30th, 1994, Terry Nichols walked into the Mid-Kansas Cooperative Association in McPherson, Kansas. The agricultural supply store served farmers throughout the region, selling seed, equipment, and fertilizer. Nichols purchased 40 50-pound bags of ammonium nitrate, a common nitrogen-based fertilizer used on corn and wheat fields across the Midwest. The purchase raised no suspicion. Ammonium nitrate was one of the most widely used fertilizers in American agriculture. Farmers bought it by the ton every planting season. Nichols paid cash and loaded the 2,000 pounds of fertilizer into his pickup truck. He returned in October to purchase an additional 50-pound bag, bringing the total to 2,050 pounds of ammonium nitrate. But ammonium nitrate alone would not create the explosion McVeigh envisioned. He needed additional materials to boost the blast's power and ensure reliable detonation. On October 3, 1994, McVeigh and Nichols broke into the Martin Marietta Rock Quarry near Marion, Kansas. The quarry used explosives to blast limestone from the earth, and its storage magazine contained everything the conspirators needed. They stole approximately 299 sticks of Tovex, a water gel explosive used in commercial blasting. They took 544 electric blasting caps, the small detonators used to trigger larger explosions. They grabbed spools of shock tube and detonating cord, the fuses that would carry the ignition signal to the main charge. The theft was clean and professional. No one noticed the missing materials for days. McVeigh also needed a fuel component to mix with the ammonium nitrate. He had studied bomb making extensively, reading military manuals and experimenting with different formulations at the Nichols farm in Michigan. He knew that ammonium nitrate combined with fuel oil created ENFO, a powerful explosive commonly used in mining operations. But he wanted something even more powerful. Nitromethane was the answer. The liquid was used as racing fuel for drag cars and model airplanes. When mixed with ammonium nitrate, it created ANM, an explosive mixture significantly more powerful than standard ANFO. McVeigh calculated that ANM would give his bomb the destructive force he wanted. In late September 1994, McVeigh traveled to a racetrack in Dallas, Texas, to purchase the nitromethane. He wore a disguise that made him look like a motorcycle enthusiast: leather jacket, bandana, dark sunglasses. He paid cash for 3 55-gallon drums of VP Racing Fuel nitromethane, spending nearly $3,000. The seller had no reason to question a customer who looked like he might be building a race car. To finance the operation, McVeigh and Nichols needed a significant amount of cash. They decided to rob Roger Moore, a gun dealer from Hot Springs, Arkansas, whom McVeigh had met on the gun show circuit. Moore was known to keep large quantities of firearms, gold, silver, and precious stones at his ranch. He was also known to distrust banks, preferring to keep his wealth on his property. On November 5, 1994, while McVeigh established an alibi elsewhere, Nichols drove to Moore's ranch in the Ozark Mountains. He tied up Moore and his companion, Karen Anderson, and ransacked the house. He took approximately $60,000 worth of guns, ammunition, gold bars, silver coins, jade, and other valuables. The robbery would finance the bombing plot and provide weapons that Michael Fortier would later sell in Arizona. McVeigh attempted to cover their tracks by sending Moore a letter claiming that government agents had committed the robbery. The letter warned Moore that the feds were targeting gun dealers and suggested he keep quiet about what had happened. Moore did not believe the story, but he had no way to prove who had actually robbed him. Throughout the fall of 1994 and into the winter of 1995, McVeigh and Nichols accumulated their materials and stored them in rented storage units scattered across Kansas. They kept the ammonium nitrate in one location, the nitromethane in another, the blasting caps and detonators in a third. By spreading the materials around, they reduced the risk that a single discovery would expose the entire plot. McVeigh rented storage units using fake names and paid in cash. He was meticulous about avoiding any paper trail that could connect him to the bombing materials. He used aliases, avoided security cameras, and varied his routine to prevent anyone from noticing his activities. The planning reflected his military training, careful, methodical, focused on operational security. On April 14, 1995, 5 days before the planned attack, McVeigh walked into Elliott's Body Shop in Junction City, Kansas. The business also operated a Ryder truck rental franchise. McVeigh approached the counter and told the clerk he needed to rent a 20-foot truck for a move to Omaha, Nebraska. He presented a South Dakota driver's license bearing the name Robert D. Kling. The license was a forgery that Lori Fortier had helped him create in Arizona, laminating a fake document that McVeigh had assembled using information from a real person's birth announcement he had found in a newspaper. The clerk, Eldon Elliott, processed the rental without suspicion. McVeigh paid a deposit and arranged to pick up the truck on April 17th. 2 days later, on Easter Sunday, April 16, 1995, McVeigh and Nichols made a final reconnaissance trip to Oklahoma City. They drove McVeigh's yellow 1977 Mercury Marquis to downtown Oklahoma City and parked it in an alley several blocks north of the Murrah building. This would be McVeigh's getaway car after the bombing. Before leaving the Mercury, McVeigh removed the license plate from the rear of the vehicle. He wanted to make the car harder to trace if anyone noticed it sitting in the alley for several days. It was a decision that seemed clever at the time, but would ultimately lead to his capture. With the getaway car in position, McVeigh and Nichols returned to Kansas. They had 3 days to assemble the bomb, load the truck, and prepare for the attack. Everything was ready. The countdown to April 19th had begun. The morning of April 19, 1995 began like any other Wednesday in Oklahoma City. The sun rose over the Oklahoma prairie around 6:45 a.m., painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The temperature was mild, climbing toward a pleasant 70 degrees. A light breeze blew from the south. It was the kind of spring morning that made people glad to live in the heartland. Throughout the city, families followed their morning routines. Parents woke their children, prepared breakfast, packed lunches, and rushed to get everyone out the door on time. Commuters filled the highways leading into downtown. Coffee shops and diners served their regular customers. Oklahoma City was waking up for another ordinary day. At the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, employees began arriving around 7:30 a.m. Security guards unlocked the doors. Maintenance workers turned on lights and adjusted thermostats. The first office workers trickled in, greeting colleagues and settling into their cubicles. By 8:30, the building was fully staffed, with approximately 500 people at their desks. Parents dropped their children at the America's Kids Daycare Center on the second floor. Babies were handed to caregivers. Toddlers ran to join their friends. Mothers and fathers kissed their children goodbye and headed upstairs to begin their workdays. The morning routine at the daycare center was familiar and comforting, the same ritual repeated hundreds of times before. In the Social Security office on the first floor, elderly citizens began lining up to speak with caseworkers. Some had questions about their benefits. Others needed help filing claims. A few were applying for disability assistance. They took numbers and settled into plastic chairs to wait their turn. 250 miles to the north, Timothy McVeigh was awake before dawn. He had spent the previous 2 nights at the Dreamland Motel in Junction City, Kansas, room number 25. He had not slept well. His mind raced through the plan again and again, checking for flaws, anticipating problems, preparing for contingencies. On April 17th and 18th, McVeigh and Terry Nichols had assembled the bomb at Geary Lake State Park, a remote recreation area south of Junction City. They worked through the night, hidden from view by the darkness and the isolation of the location. The task was physically demanding and extremely dangerous. One mistake could have detonated the explosives and killed them both. They began by nailing wooden 2x4s to the floor of the Ryder truck, creating a framework to hold the barrels in place. The boards would prevent the heavy containers from shifting during the drive to Oklahoma City. Any movement could jostle the explosive mixture or damage the fuses, potentially causing a premature detonation or a failure to detonate at all. The bomb itself consisted of 13 blue plastic barrels, each weighing between 400 and 500 pounds when filled. 9 of the barrels contained ammonium nitrate mixed with liquid nitromethane, creating the powerful A&M explosive that McVeigh had designed. The remaining 4 barrels held ammonium nitrate mixed with diesel fuel, the standard ANFO compound used in commercial mining operations. McVeigh arranged the barrels in the cargo area of the truck in a configuration shaped like a backward letter J. He positioned the heaviest concentration of explosives closest to the cab, ensuring that the main blast would be directed toward the building rather than away from it. The arrangement was designed to maximize the destructive force against the Murrah building's north face. Inside several of the barrels, McVeigh had placed small cylinders of acetylene gas. The compressed gas would add to the explosion's power, creating a larger fireball and increasing the blast pressure. He also wrapped the barrels closest to the truck's aluminum side panel with additional bags of ammonium nitrate, creating a tamping effect that would direct more of the explosion's energy toward the building. The ignition system was McVeigh's own design. He drilled holes through the floor of the truck cab, running 2 separate fuses from the driver's compartment into the cargo area. The fuses were lengths of cannon fuse, the slow-burning cord used to fire artillery pieces. One fuse was timed to burn for 5 minutes. The other, a backup, was timed for 2 minutes. The fuses led to detonators embedded in the main explosive mass. When the flame reached the detonators, they would trigger the blasting caps stolen from the Kansas quarry. The caps would initiate the TOVEX, which would in turn set off the main ANNM charge. The entire sequence from lighting the fuse to full detonation would take between 2 and 5 minutes. McVeigh also prepared a contingency in case the fuses failed. He positioned additional explosives near the driver's side of the truck, within reach of the cab. If the primary ignition system did not work, he could shoot the secondary charges with his Glock pistol, detonating the bomb manually. He was prepared to die if necessary. When the assembly was complete, McVeigh drove the loaded truck back toward Junction City while Nichols returned to his home in Harrington. The 2 men would never see each other again. Their partnership, forged at Fort Benning and tested over years of planning, ended in that Kansas State Park. On the morning of April 19th, McVeigh woke early and prepared for the drive south. He dressed in jeans and his chosen t-shirt, a yellow shirt featuring a picture of Abraham Lincoln on the front and the Latin phrase, Sic Semper Tyrannis, printed below the image. The words meant, "Thus always to tyrants," the phrase that John Wilkes Booth allegedly shouted after assassinating Lincoln in Ford's Theater in 1865. The back of the shirt featured an image of a tree dripping with blood, and a quote attributed to Thomas Jefferson, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." McVeigh had chosen his wardrobe carefully. He wanted anyone who saw him to understand his message. He was not a criminal. He was a patriot, striking back against tyranny. He carried an envelope containing pages photocopied from the Turner Diaries, the passage describing Earl Turner's truck bomb attack on FBI headquarters. He also carried his Glock Model 21 pistol loaded with black Talon hollow-point ammunition, a knife, and earplugs to protect his hearing from the blast. He had no intention of being captured alive. If cornered, he planned to fight to the death. McVeigh climbed into the cab of the Ryder truck and started the engine. The vehicle was heavy with its deadly cargo, sluggish in its acceleration. He pulled out of Junction City and headed south on Highway 77, then turned onto the Kansas Turnpike toward Oklahoma. The drive to Oklahoma City would take approximately 3 hours. As he drove, McVeigh thought about what he was about to do. He had no doubts, no second thoughts. In his mind, he was a soldier carrying out a military operation against a legitimate target. The federal employees in the Murrah building were not innocent civilians. They were agents of a tyrannical government that had murdered women and children at Ruby Ridge and Waco. They deserved what was coming. McVeigh had originally planned to detonate the bomb at 11 a.m. when the building would be at maximum occupancy. But as he drove through the Oklahoma morning, he changed his mind. He decided to strike at 9 a.m. instead. He never publicly explained the reason for this change. Perhaps he wanted more time to escape. Perhaps he simply grew impatient. Perhaps he wanted to catch the morning shift before anyone left for meetings or appointments. At approximately 8:57 a.m., the yellow Ryder truck pulled off Interstate 235 and entered downtown Oklahoma City. McVeigh navigated the streets toward the Murrah building, following the route he had memorized during his reconnaissance trips with Michael Fortier. He turned onto NW 5th Street and approached the building's north entrance. A drop-off zone fronted the building, separated from the street by a small parking area. McVeigh pulled the truck into this zone and maneuvered into a handicapped parking space directly in front of the glass facade. Above him, through the concrete and steel of the building's floor, children were playing in the America's Kids Daycare Center. He did not look up. McVeigh set the parking brake and turned off the engine. He looked up at the building that was about to be destroyed, 9 stories of concrete and glass filled with federal employees beginning their workday. Then he reached beneath his seat and retrieved the 2 fuses. He lit the 5-minute fuse first, watching the flame begin its slow crawl toward the detonators in the cargo area. Then he lit the 2-minute fuse as a backup. The flames hissed and sputtered as they burned through the coated cord. McVeigh opened the truck door, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and locked the door behind him. He walked away from the truck at a steady pace, not running, not drawing attention. He headed north on Harvey Avenue toward the alley where his Mercury Marquis was parked several blocks away. Behind him, the fuses burned through the floor of the truck cab, traveling inexorably toward the 13 barrels of explosives in the cargo area. At exactly 9:02 a.m. Central Daylight Time, the bomb detonated. The explosion was equivalent to approximately 5,000 pounds of TNT. The blast wave traveled outward at thousands of feet per second, shattering everything in its path. The pressure wave hit the Murrah building's north face like a giant fist, punching through the glass curtain wall and into the building's interior. The north face of the Murrah building, 9 stories of concrete and glass, disintegrated in a fraction of a second. Support columns that held up the upper floors were shattered by the blast. Without those columns, the floors above had nothing to support them. They pancaked down upon each other, one floor collapsing onto the next, creating a mountain of rubble where offices had stood moments before. The sound was heard 30 miles away. Windows shattered in buildings throughout downtown Oklahoma City. Car alarms triggered for blocks in every direction. The ground shook as if an earthquake had struck. A massive cloud of dust and debris rose into the morning sky, visible from miles away. Where the north side of the Murrah building had stood moments before, there was now a gaping wound. Floors had pancaked down upon each other. Concrete pillars had crumbled into rubble. Office furniture, filing cabinets, computers, and human bodies were mixed together in a mountain of debris. The building looked as if a giant had taken a bite out of it. The blast created a crater 30 feet wide and 8 feet deep in the street where the truck had been parked. Cars in the parking area were incinerated. The blast wave radiated outward, damaging more than 300 buildings in the surrounding area. Glass shattered for blocks in every direction. People on the street were knocked off their feet by the pressure wave. 168 people died in the blast. 680 others were injured, many grievously. Burns, lacerations, broken bones, traumatic brain injuries, loss of limbs. The hospitals of Oklahoma City were overwhelmed with casualties. The deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history had just occurred. The America's Kids Daycare Center was obliterated. 19 children were among the dead. They had been playing with toys, eating breakfast, napping on small mats when the truck bomb exploded directly beneath them. The floor collapsed. The walls disintegrated. They had no warning and no chance to survive. Among them was Bailey Allman. She was 1 year old. She had been born on April 18, 1994, which meant that April 19, 1995, was the day after her first birthday. Her mother, Erin Allman, was a 22-year-old single mother who worked at an insurance company near downtown Oklahoma City. Every morning she dropped Bailey at the America's Kids Daycare Center before heading to her office. Bailey had just learned to walk. She was a happy baby with bright eyes and a smile that delighted everyone who saw her. She loved playing with the other children at the daycare center, toddling around on her new legs, exploring the world with the curiosity of a child discovering everything for the first time. She had celebrated her first birthday the day before, with cake and presents, and the love of her family. On the morning of April 19th, Erin Allman kissed her daughter goodbye and handed her to a caregiver at America's Kids. She had no way of knowing it would be the last time she would see Bailey alive. Minutes later, she was at her desk when she heard the explosion and felt her building shake. She knew immediately that something terrible had happened. A firefighter named Chris Fields was among the first responders to reach the Murrah building. He was 30 years old, a captain with the Oklahoma City Fire Department. He had seen death before in his career, but nothing had prepared him for what he found in the rubble that morning. Fields was searching through the debris near the north entrance when he discovered Bailey's body. She was covered in dust and blood but appeared almost peaceful, as if she might be sleeping. He picked her up gently, cradling her against his chest, and carried her toward the triage area, where medical personnel were treating survivors. A photographer named Charles Porter IV captured the moment. His image showed Fields carrying Bailey from the wreckage. It won the Pulitzer Prize and became the defining image of the Oklahoma City bombing. The photograph haunted Chris Fields for years afterward. He suffered from post-traumatic stress, struggled with nightmares and depression, and eventually had to leave the fire department. The youngest victim was Gabrion Bruce, just 4 months old. His mother, Kimberly, also died in the blast, their lives ending together in the same terrible instant. Chase Smith was 3 years old. Colton Smith was 2. Aaron Coverdale was 5, the oldest child killed in the daycare center. His 2-year-old brother Elijah died beside him. Their names would become a painful reminder of McVeigh's cruelty. The adult victims came from every walk of life and represented the diverse community that Oklahoma City had become. Carrie Lenz was 26 years old and 8 months pregnant. She worked as a legal technician for the Drug Enforcement Administration on the 9th floor of the Murrah building. She had been looking forward to the birth of her son, whom she planned to name Michael. She had decorated a nursery at home and picked out baby clothes. She had dreams for her child's future. When the bomb exploded, Carrie was at her desk. The 9th floor collapsed into the floors below, burying her under tons of concrete and steel. Rescue workers found her body days later. Her unborn son Michael had died with her. Under Oklahoma law, Michael James Lenz III was counted as the 169th victim of the bombing, even though he had never taken a breath outside his mother's womb. Rebecca Anderson was a 37-year-old nurse who lived and worked near downtown Oklahoma City. When she heard the explosion and saw the plume of smoke rising from the Murrah building, she did not run away. She ran toward the disaster, determined to help the injured. Anderson entered the damaged building without hesitation, climbing over rubble and searching for survivors. She helped evacuate wounded people and directed rescue workers toward victims who needed immediate attention. She was performing the work she had trained for, the work that defined her life. While searching through the debris on an upper floor, Anderson was struck on the head by falling concrete. She suffered a severe brain injury and was rushed to the hospital. She never regained consciousness. She died 4 days later, the only rescue worker killed as a result of the bombing. A scholarship fund was established in her name to support nursing students. The victims ranged in age from 4 months to 73 years. They included black and white Americans, men and women, Christians and Jews and Muslims. 98 of the dead worked for the federal government. 40 were visitors to the building who had come to conduct business with various agencies. 8 were federal law enforcement officers whose deaths allowed prosecutors to charge McVeigh with murder under federal law. Many victims left behind families who would struggle for years with grief, anger, and unanswered questions. Children grew up without parents. Husbands and wives became widows and widowers. Parents buried their children, the most unnatural loss any human being can experience. The ripples of suffering spread outward from the Murrah building, touching thousands of lives across Oklahoma and beyond. But even as rescue workers dug through the rubble searching for survivors, even as families gathered at hospitals praying for news of their loved ones, the man responsible for all this suffering was already in custody. He had been caught less than 90 minutes after the explosion, and he was sitting in a county jail cell just 78 miles away, watching television coverage of his own handiwork. Oklahoma Highway Patrol Trooper Charles J. Hanger had no idea he was about to make the most important arrest in American law enforcement history. He was driving south on Interstate 35 when the bomb exploded 78 miles to the south, heading toward his regular patrol zone in Noble County. He was a veteran officer with nearly 17 years on the force, a tall man with a calm demeanor and a methodical approach to his work. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for what this day would bring. At 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995, Hanger was heading toward his regular patrol zone when his radio crackled with an urgent dispatch. An explosion had occurred in downtown Oklahoma City. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building had been hit. Mass casualties were reported. All available units were ordered to respond immediately. Hanger pressed the accelerator and headed south toward the Capitol. Like every other law enforcement officer in Oklahoma that morning, he wanted to help. The initial reports described chaos and destruction on a scale that seemed almost impossible. Something terrible had happened, and every instinct told him to get there as quickly as possible. Then came a second message. Highway Patrol Command ordered Hanger to disregard the call to Oklahoma City. He was told to turn around and return to his assigned area in Noble County. The reasoning was sound, if frustrating. Even during a catastrophic emergency, the Highway Patrol needed to maintain coverage throughout the state. Crime did not stop because of a disaster. Traffic accidents still happened. People still needed help on the rural highways. Someone had to keep watching the roads. Hanger pulled into the median, made a U-turn, and headed back north on Interstate 35. He was disappointed to be pulled away from the crisis, but he understood his duty. He would patrol his assigned area and listen to the radio reports as the horror in Oklahoma City unfolded. A few miles north, Hanger spotted 2 women standing beside a disabled van on the shoulder of the highway. Their vehicle had broken down, and they were stranded in the April heat. Hanger pulled over to assist them, helping them contact a tow truck and ensuring they were safe while they waited for help to arrive. While Hanger was assisting the stranded motorists, a yellow 1977 Mercury Marquise passed by in the northbound lane of Interstate 35. The car was unremarkable, just another vehicle on a busy highway. Hanger did not notice it. He was focused on the women and their broken van. The Mercury continued north, its driver maintaining a steady speed just below the limit. Hanger finished helping the motorists and returned to his patrol car. He pulled back onto the interstate and resumed his northbound patrol. His mind was still on Oklahoma City, still wondering what had happened and whether the casualties were as severe as the early reports suggested. He listened to the radio chatter as dispatchers coordinated the emergency response. Then he noticed something. A yellow car was traveling in the right lane ahead of him, moving slightly slower than the surrounding traffic. As Hanger drew closer, he realized it was a Mercury Marquise, an older model from the late 1970s. Something about the car caught his attention. Something was not right. Hanger looked at the rear of the vehicle and immediately identified the problem. The car had no license plate. The bracket where the plate should have been was empty, just bare metal where a registration tag should have been displayed. In Oklahoma, driving without a license plate was a misdemeanor offense, a minor violation, but one that required investigation. Hanger had no way of knowing that the missing plate was deliberate. Timothy McVeigh had removed it 3 days earlier when he positioned the Mercury as his getaway car near the Murrah building. He had intended the missing plate to make the car harder to trace if anyone noticed it sitting in the alley for several days. Instead, the missing plate gave Trooper Hanger the probable cause he needed to initiate a traffic stop. Hanger activated his emergency lights and pulled behind the Mercury. The driver responded immediately, signaling and pulling onto the shoulder of the highway. The stop occurred near mile marker 202, just south of the town of Perry in Noble County. It was 10:20 a.m., exactly 78 minutes after the bomb had exploded in Oklahoma City. Hanger approached the vehicle using standard traffic stop procedures. He walked along the driver's side of the car, staying alert for any signs of danger. The driver remained in his seat with his hands visible on the steering wheel. He appeared calm and cooperative, showing no signs of nervousness or hostility. The driver was a young white male, tall and thin, with a military-style crew cut. He was wearing a windbreaker over a yellow t-shirt. His face was expressionless, neither friendly nor hostile. He looked like any other young man who might be driving through rural Oklahoma on a spring morning. Hanger asked the driver for his license and registration. The man reached slowly toward his jacket pocket, moving deliberately and keeping his hands visible. He produced a Michigan driver's license and handed it through the window. The name on the license was Timothy James McVeigh. The address was listed in Decker, Michigan, the location of the Nichols family farm. McVeigh explained that the car belonged to a friend. He said he did not have the registration because the vehicle was borrowed. He offered no explanation for the missing license plate. His tone was polite but flat, devoid of emotion. He answered Hanger's questions directly, without volunteering additional information. As McVeigh reached for his wallet, Hanger noticed something that changed the nature of the encounter. There was a bulge beneath McVeigh's windbreaker, on his left side, under his arm. The shape was distinctive, recognizable to any experienced law enforcement officer. McVeigh was carrying a concealed weapon. Hanger's training took over. He kept his voice calm but firm. He asked McVeigh directly whether he was carrying a firearm. McVeigh did not hesitate, did not try to deceive the officer. He answered honestly. "Yes, I have a gun," McVeigh said. His voice was steady, almost matter-of-fact. "It's loaded." Hanger did not wait for further explanation. In one fluid motion, he drew his service weapon and pressed it against the back of McVeigh's head. His finger was on the trigger. His voice carried the authority of a man who had made dozens of similar arrests. "So is mine," Hanger replied. Hanger ordered McVeigh to step out of the vehicle slowly, keeping his hands visible at all times. McVeigh complied without resistance. He moved carefully, following every instruction precisely. He made no sudden movements, no attempts to reach for his weapon, no effort to flee. He seemed almost resigned to what was happening. Hanger removed the concealed weapon from McVeigh's shoulder holster. It was a Glock Model 21, a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The gun was loaded with Black Talon hollow-point ammunition, a particularly deadly type of round designed to expand upon impact and cause maximum tissue damage. McVeigh had been prepared for violence. Hanger also found a 5-inch knife clipped to McVeigh's belt. The weapon was legal, but added to the trooper's concern about the nature of the man he had stopped. Hanger handcuffed McVeigh and placed him in the back of his patrol car. The traffic stop had escalated into an arrest for carrying a concealed weapon, a felony in Oklahoma for anyone without a valid permit. McVeigh sat quietly in the back of the patrol car as Hanger ran his information through the system. The computer check revealed no outstanding warrants. The Michigan license appeared to be valid. There was nothing to indicate that the cooperative young man in handcuffs was anything more than a motorist who had made the mistake of carrying a concealed weapon without a permit. But Hanger was a careful officer. Before leaving the scene, he searched McVeigh more thoroughly. In McVeigh's pocket, he found a small envelope containing several documents. Among them were pages photocopied from the Turner diaries, including the passage describing Earl Turner's truck bomb attack on FBI headquarters. There were also quotations about patriotism and revolution. Hanger also found a business card in the patrol car that McVeigh had apparently tried to discard while handcuffed in the back seat. The card was from a military surplus store in Wisconsin. On the back, handwritten in blue ink, were the words, "TNT at $5 a stick. Need more." None of this made sense to Hanger at the time. He had no way to connect the strange documents and cryptic note to the explosion that had occurred in Oklahoma City 90 minutes earlier. He was simply arresting a man on weapons charges, following standard procedures for what seemed like a routine felony stop. Hanger transported McVeigh to the Noble County Jail in Perry, Oklahoma, a small facility that served the rural county. McVeigh was processed into the system, photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell. He was cooperative throughout the booking process, answering questions politely and following all instructions. The jailers noticed something unusual about McVeigh. His hands did not sweat during fingerprinting, a telltale sign of nervousness that booking officers looked for when processing new inmates. His pulse was steady. His demeanor was calm. He showed no anxiety about being arrested, no concern about his situation. He was, in the words of one jailer, cool as ice. A small television in the booking area was tuned to news coverage of the Oklahoma City bombing. Images of the destroyed Murrah building filled the screen. Reporters described the chaos and the mounting death toll. Rescue workers pulled bodies from the rubble. The worst terrorist attack in American history at the time was unfolding in real time. McVeigh stood with the officers and watched the coverage. He said nothing. His expression did not change. He simply stared at the screen, watching the destruction he had caused, showing no emotion whatsoever. The jailers had no idea they were standing next to the man responsible for the devastation they were watching. McVeigh was booked on charges of carrying a concealed weapon, transporting a loaded firearm, and driving without a license plate. His bond was set at $5,000. If he could post bail, he would be free to walk out of the Noble County Jail and disappear. For the next 2 days, Timothy McVeigh sat in his cell, watching television coverage of the bombing and waiting to see if anyone would connect him to the attack. The FBI was launching the largest investigation in its history, interviewing thousands of witnesses and following hundreds of leads. But no one knew that the bomber was already in custody, sitting in a rural county jail less than 80 miles from the crime scene. The clock was ticking. If McVeigh posted bail before the FBI identified him, he would vanish. Justice would be denied. The victims would never know who killed them. The FBI launched Operation OK Bomb within hours of the explosion. It would become the largest criminal investigation in American history, eventually involving more than 2,000 agents, 28,000 interviews, and nearly 1 billion pieces of information. The initial assumption was that foreign terrorists were responsible, but experienced investigators kept an open mind. The date of the attack, April 19th, suggested a domestic connection. It was the second anniversary of the Waco fire, a date that held deep significance for the militia movement. The location, Oklahoma City, was far from typical targets of international terrorism, and the method, a truck bomb made from agricultural fertilizer, was more consistent with domestic extremism than with foreign terrorist groups. The first major break came within 24 hours. An FBI agent searching the debris field found the rear axle of a truck, blown clear of the blast crater and lying in a parking lot across the street. Burned into the metal was a vehicle identification number, a unique code that could be traced to the truck's manufacturer and ultimately to the rental agency that had leased it. Agents traced the number to a Ryder truck that had been rented from Elliott's Body Shop in Junction City, Kansas. The truck had been rented on April 17th, just 2 days before the bombing, for a supposed move to Omaha, Nebraska. The renter had given his name as Robert D. Kling. FBI artists worked with employees at the body shop to create composite sketches of the renter. Eldon Elliott, the owner, remembered the man clearly. He was tall and thin, with a military-style crew cut and a calm demeanor. He had paid in cash and shown a South Dakota driver's license. The sketch was distributed to law enforcement agencies and media outlets across the country. The FBI set up a command post in Junction City and began canvassing the area. Agents showed the composite sketch to every motel clerk, restaurant worker, and gas station attendant in town. They were looking for anyone who had seen a man matching that description in the days before the bombing. Lee McGowan, the manager of the Dreamland Motel, recognized the sketch immediately. A man matching that description had stayed at her motel for several nights before the bombing. He had registered under a different name than Robert Kling. He had registered as Timothy McVeigh, and he had listed a Michigan address. The address was in Decker, Michigan, and it belonged to James Nichols, brother of Terry Nichols. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. By April 21st, 2 days after the bombing, the FBI had a name and a face. They ran Timothy McVeigh through the National Crime Information Center database and made a startling discovery. McVeigh was already in custody. He had been arrested 90 minutes after the bombing and was sitting in the Noble County Jail in Perry, Oklahoma, about to be released on bail. FBI agents rushed to Perry and placed a hold on McVeigh just hours before he was scheduled to be released. If they had been a few hours later, McVeigh would have walked out of the jail a free man. He might have disappeared forever, his identity unknown, his crime unpunished. The agents searched Trooper Hanger's patrol car and found the business card that McVeigh had tried to discard. They tested the clothing McVeigh had been wearing at the time of his arrest and found traces of explosive residue. The chemicals matched the signature of an ANFO bomb. McVeigh had been covered in evidence linking him directly to the explosion. The case was coming together rapidly. Within days, investigators had identified Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier as co-conspirators. Nichols surrendered voluntarily in Kansas after learning he was wanted for questioning. Fortier, facing drug charges and terrified of spending the rest of his life in prison, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Fortier's testimony was devastating. He described McVeigh's detailed planning, the reconnaissance trip to Oklahoma City, the construction of the bomb. He testified that McVeigh had shown him diagrams of the explosive device and explained exactly how and when the attack would occur. He admitted that his wife Lori had helped laminate the fake driver's license McVeigh used to rent the truck. A search of Nichols's home in Harrington, Kansas, produced a mountain of evidence. Investigators found blasting caps and detonating cord from the quarry burglary. They found ammonium nitrate in fuel containers. They found anti-government literature and copies of the Turner Diaries. They found a hand-drawn map of downtown Oklahoma City with the Murrah building clearly marked. They also found a receipt for the ammonium nitrate purchase and a telephone calling card that had been used to make calls connecting McVeigh, Nichols, and Fortier in the weeks before the bombing. The paper trail was extensive and damning. The investigation continued for months, but the core facts were established within the first few weeks. Timothy McVeigh had planned and executed the bombing. Terry Nichols had helped him acquire materials and build the bomb. Michael Fortier had known about the plot and done nothing to stop it. All three men faced federal charges that could result in the death penalty. The most wanted man in America had been caught because he removed the license plate from his getaway car. A routine traffic stop by a highway patrol trooper had led to the arrest of a mass murderer. It was a small mistake with enormous consequences, a reminder that even the most careful plans can be undone by simple oversight. On April 21, 1995, the world got its first look at Timothy McVeigh. Federal agents escorted him from the Noble County Courthouse to a waiting helicopter that would transport him to Oklahoma City for his initial court appearance. Cameras captured every moment. McVeigh emerged from the courthouse in an orange gel jumpsuit, his wrists shackled, surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. His face showed no emotion. His eyes scanned the crowd with a cold, methodical gaze. He later told biographers he was looking for snipers, using a technique he had learned in the Army to identify potential threats. Even in handcuffs, he was thinking tactically. The crowd outside the courthouse was hostile. People shouted "baby killer" and hurled insults at the prisoner. Some wept openly. Others screamed in rage. McVeigh ignored them all. He walked steadily toward the helicopter, his expression never changing, his eyes never wavering. In that moment, he became one of the most recognizable faces in America. Many people expected the bomber to be a foreign terrorist. In the hours after the explosion, media speculation had focused on Middle Eastern extremists. The assumption was that only foreign enemies would attack American civilians so brutally. The Oklahoma City bombing must be connected to the same forces that had attacked the World Trade Center 2 years earlier. Instead, the bomber was a clean-cut, crew-cut, all-American young man. He was a decorated Gulf War veteran who had earned the Bronze Star for bravery in combat. He came from a suburban community in western New York. He looked like someone's son, someone's neighbor, someone's coworker. The face of domestic terrorism did not match what anyone expected. The realization that the bomber was American, not foreign, shocked the nation. It forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth. The greatest threat to their safety might come not from overseas enemies, but from their own citizens. The militia movement, which had been growing in the shadows, was suddenly exposed to national scrutiny. Within days, investigators had also arrested Terry Nichols. He surrendered voluntarily in Harrington, Kansas, after learning he was wanted for questioning. Unlike McVeigh, who remained silent and defiant, Nichols tried to talk his way out of trouble. He consented to a search of his home, apparently believing that cooperation would help his case. The search produced overwhelming evidence of his involvement. The FBI also identified Michael Fortier as a person of interest. Under intense pressure and facing serious drug charges, Fortier agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence and immunity for his wife Lori. His testimony would prove crucial in establishing the full scope of the conspiracy. In August 1995, a federal grand jury indicted McVeigh and Nichols on 11 counts, including conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, using a weapon of mass destruction, destruction by explosives, and 8 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of federal law enforcement officers killed in the bombing. Attorney General Janet Reno announced that the government would seek the death penalty for both defendants. The stage was set for one of the most watched trials in American history. The trial of Timothy McVeigh began on April 24, 1997, exactly 2 years and 5 days after the bombing. The case had been moved from Oklahoma City to Denver, Colorado, after federal judge Richard Paul Match ruled that McVeigh and Nichols could not receive fair trials in Oklahoma, where virtually every resident had been affected by the bombing. Separate trials were ordered, with McVeigh to be tried first. Lead prosecutor Joseph Hartzler approached the jury in a wheelchair, having been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis years earlier. His physical limitation did nothing to diminish the power of his words. His opening statement was a masterpiece of prosecutorial storytelling, painting a vivid picture of April 19, 1995, and the horror that Timothy McVeigh had unleashed. Hartzler began by describing a beautiful spring morning in Oklahoma City. He told the jury about the federal workers arriving at their offices, the visitors coming to conduct business, the parents dropping their children at the daycare center. He made the victims real, individual human beings with families and dreams and futures that McVeigh had stolen from them. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against McVeigh. Witnesses from the rental agency identified him as the man who had rented the Ryder truck under the alias Robert Kling. Motel employees placed him in Junction City in the days before the bombing. Forensic experts testified that explosive residue on his clothing matched the chemical signature of the bomb. Michael Fortier took the stand as the government's star witness. He described how McVeigh had shown him diagrams of the bomb, how they had driven to Oklahoma City together to scout the target, how McVeigh had explained exactly how and when the attack would occur. Fortier's testimony directly connected McVeigh to every aspect of the conspiracy. Lori Fortier testified that she had laminated the fake driver's license McVeigh used to rent the truck. She described seeing McVeigh arrange soup cans on her living room floor to demonstrate how he would position the bomb barrels in the truck. She confirmed that McVeigh had told her the attack would happen on April 19th. Stephen Jones, McVeigh's defense attorney, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming. Dozens of witnesses placed McVeigh at the scene of the crime or connected him to the conspiracy. Physical evidence linked him directly to the bomb. His own co-conspirators had testified against him. Jones tried to create reasonable doubt. He suggested that other conspirators might have been involved, that the investigation had been rushed, that eyewitness accounts were unreliable. He showed the jury a controversial video called Waco, the Big Lie, attempting to provide context for McVeigh's motivations and suggest that the government bore some responsibility for what had happened. McVeigh himself wanted to present a necessity defense, arguing that his bombing was a justified response to government crimes at Ruby Ridge and Waco. Jones refused to pursue this strategy, knowing that no jury would accept the murder of 168 people, including 19 children, as justified under any circumstances. The jury deliberated for 23 hours over 4 days. On June 2, 1997, they returned with their verdict. Timothy James McVeigh was guilty on all 11 counts. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He had expected this outcome and prepared for it. The trial moved to the penalty phase. Prosecutors presented testimony from survivors and victims' families. They described the horror of the explosion, the grief of losing loved ones, the permanent physical and emotional scars left by McVeigh's bomb. Parents testified about children who would never grow up. Spouses described the void left by partners who would never come home. Defense attorneys argued for a life sentence, presenting evidence of McVeigh's troubled childhood, his military service, his mental deterioration after the Gulf War. But McVeigh had made clear he preferred death to life in prison. He did not want to spend decades in a cell. He wanted to be executed, to become a martyr for his cause. On June 13, 1997, the jury sentenced Timothy McVeigh to death. He received the sentence without visible reaction. He had gotten what he wanted. Terry Nichols faced his own federal trial in December 1997. Unlike McVeigh, Nichols had not been present at the bombing. His defense argued that he had withdrawn from the conspiracy before the attack, that McVeigh had manipulated him, and that he never intended for anyone to die. The jury was not entirely convinced by the prosecution's case. They found Nichols guilty of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter. But they acquitted him of the most serious charges, including first-degree murder. Unable to reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty, they recommended life in prison. Judge Richard Match sentenced Nichols to life without the possibility of parole. But that was not the end of his legal troubles. In 2004, the state of Oklahoma tried Nichols on 161 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each non-federal victim, plus the unborn child of Carrie Lenz. After a 2-month trial, he was convicted on all counts. The jury deadlocked on whether Nichols should receive the death penalty. Judge Stephen Taylor sentenced him to 161 consecutive life terms without parole. Terry Nichols will spend the rest of his life in federal prison. He is currently housed at the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. He will never be released. Michael Fortier received a different fate. In exchange for his testimony against McVeigh and Nichols, he pleaded guilty to reduced charges, including failure to report a crime and lying to federal investigators. On May 27, 1998, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to pay $75,000 in restitution. Fortier served approximately 85% of his sentence. He was released from federal prison on January 20, 2006, and entered the Federal Witness Protection Program with his wife Lori and their children. They received new identities and relocated to an undisclosed location. They are prohibited from contacting former friends or family members and cannot give media interviews. 40 years' deal with prosecutors saved him from spending the rest of his life in prison. But it came at a cost. He lives in hiding, forever looking over his shoulder, knowing that some people will never forgive him for his role in the bombing. He escaped justice in a legal sense, but he will never escape the knowledge of what he helped make possible. After his sentencing, Timothy McVeigh was transferred to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, known as ADX Florence or the Supermax. It is the most secure federal prison in America, housing the most dangerous criminals in the federal system. McVeigh joined other infamous inmates, including Unabomber Ted Kaczynski and World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Youssef. Life at ADX Florence was solitary and monotonous. Inmates spent 23 hours a day in small concrete cells with minimal human contact. They ate alone, exercised alone, and had limited access to television, reading materials, or other diversions. The isolation was designed to prevent communication between dangerous prisoners and to eliminate the possibility of escape. McVeigh adapted to the routine. He read extensively, wrote letters to supporters and journalists, and occasionally communicated with other high-profile inmates. He showed no signs of remorse for his crime. If anything, his time in prison hardened his views. He remained convinced that his bombing was justified, that he was a patriot who had struck a blow against tyranny. In 1999, McVeigh was transferred to the federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. This would be his final home. He continued to write letters and gave extensive interviews to journalists Lou Michel and Dan Herbeck of the Buffalo News, who were writing a book about his life. The resulting book, American Terrorist, Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City Bombing, was based on 75 hours of interviews with McVeigh. In it, he explained his motivations in detail. He expressed no remorse for the bombing. He dismissed the victims as collateral damage, the same term the military used for civilian casualties in wartime. He said his only regret was not completely destroying the federal building. McVeigh made a calculated decision to drop his appeals. He announced that he would rather die than spend the rest of his life in prison. His attorneys tried to dissuade him, arguing that there were still legal avenues to explore. But McVeigh was adamant. He saw himself as a soldier who had struck a blow against tyranny. Execution would make him a martyr. Life in prison would make him irrelevant. In January 2001, the Bureau of Prisons set McVeigh's execution date for May 16th. He would be the first federal prisoner executed since 1963, when Victor Feguer was hanged for kidnapping and murder. The execution would take place at Terre Haute, with selected witnesses, including victims' family members and media representatives. 6 days before the scheduled execution, Attorney General John Ashcroft announced a delay. The FBI had discovered thousands of documents related to the case that had never been turned over to McVeigh's defense attorneys. The documents were the result of a computer error that had prevented their disclosure during trial. The execution was postponed for 1 month while lawyers reviewed the materials. McVeigh was furious about the delay. He wanted to die on schedule. His lawyers reviewed the newly discovered documents and found nothing that would have changed the outcome of his trial. The evidence against McVeigh was overwhelming, and the new documents did not alter that fact. The execution was rescheduled for June 11, 2001. On June 10, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was moved from his holding cell to the death house at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute. He spent his final day in a small concrete cell adjacent to the execution chamber. Prison guards watched him constantly through a window in the cell door. McVeigh remained calm throughout his last hours. When the prison shower initially ran cold, he joked to guards that it was cruel and unusual punishment. He met with his attorneys for a final consultation. He watched television and tried to sleep, though prison logs showed he tossed and turned through the night. In a surprise to many who knew him, McVeigh requested a Catholic chaplain. Despite having publicly identified as agnostic in the months before his execution, he accepted the last rites of the Catholic Church. Father Charles Smith administered the sacrament in the hours before dawn. Whether this represented a genuine return to faith or simply a hedge against the unknown, only McVeigh knew. For his final meal, McVeigh ordered 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. The request was modest compared to the elaborate last meals chosen by other condemned prisoners. He had no interest in a final feast. He was ready to die. McVeigh had prepared a final statement. He chose the 1875 poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley. The poem, whose title means unconquered in Latin, speaks of maintaining dignity and self-determination in the face of death and suffering. Its final lines would serve as McVeigh's last message to the world. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Outside the prison, crowds gathered. Death penalty opponents held vigils and protests, arguing that the execution would not bring closure and that state-sponsored killing was wrong, regardless of the crime. Supporters of the execution waited to hear confirmation that justice had been done. More than 1,000 journalists from around the world had descended on the small Indiana city to cover the story. In Oklahoma City, hundreds of survivors and victims' family members gathered at a special viewing site. For the first time in American history, an execution would be broadcast via closed-circuit television to allow victims to watch. The technology was encrypted and carefully controlled to prevent recording. The victims had asked for this opportunity, wanting to witness the death of the man who had killed their loved ones. At 7 a.m. on June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was strapped to a T-shaped gurney in the execution chamber. He helped position himself on the gurney, showing no resistance or hesitation. Intravenous lines were inserted into his right leg. He was wrapped tightly in a white sheet, with only his face and one arm visible. The curtains were opened to reveal him to the witnesses. Approximately 30 people watched from behind glass partitions. 10 media representatives, 10 survivors and victims' family members, and 10 government officials and McVeigh supporters. McVeigh looked at each group in turn, making eye contact with his supporters, the media, and the victims' families. His expression was blank, unreadable. When asked if he had any final words, McVeigh said nothing. He had already submitted his written statement, the text of Invictus. He chose silence in his final moments, denying the victims the satisfaction of hearing him speak. At 7:10 a.m., the warden of the Terre Haute Penitentiary gave the order to proceed. The execution team began administering the 3-drug protocol that would end Timothy McVeigh's life. The first drug was sodium thiopental, a barbiturate that would render McVeigh unconscious within seconds. As the drug entered his bloodstream, his eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling. His expression did not change. The second drug was pancuronium bromide, a paralytic agent that would stop his voluntary muscle movements, including his ability to breathe. The drug ensured that any physical responses to the third drug would not be visible to witnesses. The third drug was potassium chloride, which would stop his heart and cause death. The drug causes intense burning pain if administered to a conscious person, but the first 2 drugs ensured that McVeigh would feel nothing. Witnesses watched through the glass partition as the drugs took effect. McVeigh's skin grew pale. His lips lost their color. He took several deep breaths, then grew still. His eyes remained open throughout the process, staring blankly at the ceiling. At 7:14 a.m., Timothy James McVeigh was pronounced dead. He was 33 years old. The entire execution had taken less than 5 minutes from the first injection to the declaration of death. McVeigh never spoke during the execution. When given the opportunity for final words, he simply stared. His handwritten copy of Invictus was distributed to witnesses after his death. The poem spoke of an unconquerable soul that remained unbowed by circumstance. It was a final statement of defiance from a man who believed he had struck a righteous blow against tyranny. Witnesses described McVeigh's expression as blank and emotionless. Larry Witcher, whose brother Alan died in the bombing, said McVeigh looked defiant, as if he would do it all over again if given the chance. Others said he looked tired, hollowed out, nothing like the vital young soldier who had once dreamed of becoming a Green Beret. In Oklahoma City, Survivors and family members reacted to the news with a mixture of relief and grief. Many said the execution brought closure, though they acknowledged it could not bring back those they had lost. Others felt empty, realizing that McVeigh's death did nothing to heal the wounds he had inflicted. Some had hoped to see remorse, some sign that McVeigh understood the enormity of what he had done. They saw only defiance. President George W. Bush issued a statement marking the occasion. "The victims of the Oklahoma City bombing have been given not vengeance but justice," he said. One young man met the fate he chose for himself 6 years ago. McVeigh's body was cremated at a funeral home in Terre Haute. His ashes were given to his attorney, who announced that their final destination would remain secret forever. McVeigh had considered having his ashes scattered over the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, or even at the Oklahoma City Memorial, but he decided both options were too provocative. In death, as in life, Timothy McVeigh sought to control his legacy. The Oklahoma City bombing changed America in ways both visible and invisible. In the immediate aftermath, Congress passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which restricted access to habeas corpus appeals and increased penalties for terrorism-related crimes. Security at federal buildings was dramatically enhanced, with concrete barriers, metal detectors, and armed guards becoming standard features. The nation's law enforcement agencies began paying closer attention to domestic extremist groups. Where the Murrah Building once stood, a memorial now honors those who died. The Oklahoma City National Memorial was dedicated on April 19, 2000, exactly 5 years after the bombing. It includes a reflecting pool, flanked by 2 bronze gates inscribed with the times 9:01 and 9:03, representing the moment before and after the explosion. The pool reflects the sky and the surrounding landscape, creating a place of peace and contemplation. 168 empty chairs stand in rows on the memorial grounds, one for each victim. The chairs are bronze and stone, arranged according to what floor of the building each person occupied. 19 smaller chairs represent the children who died. At night, the chairs glow softly, illuminated from within, creating a haunting image of absence and loss. A survivor tree, an American elm that withstood the blast and the fires that followed, still grows on the memorial grounds. The tree lost most of its branches in the explosion and was initially scheduled for removal, but it survived, putting out new growth in the spring following the bombing. It has become a symbol of resilience and hope. Seeds from the tree have been planted across the country, growing into living memorials to those who perished. The community response to the bombing became known as the Oklahoma Standard. Thousands of volunteers appeared to help with rescue efforts, donate blood, provide food, and comfort the grieving. First responders from across the country arrived to assist. The generosity and compassion shown by ordinary citizens became a model for disaster response. But the bombing also left deep scars that have never fully healed. Survivors suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and physical disabilities that affected them for the rest of their lives. Families were shattered by loss. Children grew up without parents. Parents endured the unbearable grief of burying their children. The psychological wounds spread outward from the Murrah Building, touching thousands of lives in ways that statistics cannot capture. If you found this documentary informative, please subscribe to No Way Out and hit the notification bell so you never miss our in-depth coverage of cases that shaped American history. Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts on this case. Share this video with others who want to understand how ordinary people can be led down the path to extraordinary evil. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and remember, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would use violence to silence their fellow citizens. This has been No Way Out. Thank you for watching.